The Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers focus question: what can people learn from studying the history of the Buffalo Soldiers? A new army. More than 5,000 black soldiers helped the United States gain freedom from Great Britain during the Revolutionary War. Nearly 100 years later, more than 1,700,000 black soldiers helped the Northern Union Army win the Civil War in 1865. It wasn't until after this war, however, that black men were allowed to join the army during times of peace. In 1866, Congress passed an act that created the first peacemeant regiments of black soldiers. Many black men who joined these regiments had served in the Union Army. Others were once enslaved people. The 38th through 41st, 1st Infantry Regiments and the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments were the first black units formed in 1866. The infantry was made up of soldiers who fought on foot, while the cavalry was made up of soldiers who rode on horses. Native peoples of the Great Plains first called the men of the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers. Soon, though, the name was given to all men who served in these regiments. Joining the army. After the Civil War, white lawmakers in the South passed new laws that greatly restrict the freedom of black people. These racist laws were known as black codes. They required black people to have a job but also limited the kinds of jobs that were allowed to have, usually farming or service positions. Black people were required to sign work contracts each year for very low pay. If they didn't, they would be arrested and forced to do unpaid work either in jail or for a white person. In 1864, the Army began paying all soldiers the same salary, regardless of their race. At most jobs, black workers were paid much less than white workers. Joining the U.S. Army was one of very few options black men had to make a fair salary. As soldiers, most could earn more money than they would at any other job while also receiving food, clothes, and shelter. Joining the army also gave black men the chance to learn how to read and write if they didn't already know how. Black soldiers experienced the racial discrimination, however. Most white soldiers and officers didn't think black soldiers should be allowed to serve in the army. Many white officers even refused to command black regiments. The soldiers also faced racism from white civilians who didn't want armed black soldiers near their towns. For this reason, most black soldiers were sent to the Great Plains and deserts in the West. Black women in war. Although women weren't allowed to enlist in the U.S. Army until 1943, black women have played an important role in every war in American history. Spies like Mary Jane Richards and Harriet Tubman obtained and passed along valuable information to the Union Army during the Civil War. Tubman also acted as a guide and a scout, accompanying Union soldiers in raids on the plantations in the South and leading hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. Actress Josephine Baker spied on the Nazis during World War II, passing along information through secret messages written in invisible ink. Thousands of black women have contributed to war efforts as spies, scouts, guides, nurses, doctors, and soldiers, despite facing both gender and racial discrimination. Out west. In the 1800s, the U.S. government wanted to expand the country's borders westward. The government signed many agreements with native leaders in the West that established borders between U.S. land and native lands. However, the government broke these agreements. This led to decades of war between the army and native peoples, who were defending lands they'd lived on for thousands of years. These native peoples included the Apache, Cheyenne, and Kiowa, among others. Over time, the government forced more and more native peoples of their lands and onto reservations. Reservations were small areas of land, usually the poorest farming and hunting lands available. The government also encouraged the mass killing of buffalo by settlers and soldiers. They knew the buffalo were crucial to native people's diet and way of life on the plains. Starvation was common on the reservations and illnesses spread quickly through the crowded communities. Many native peoples resist being forced onto reservations and fought black against the army. Black soldiers were sent to the west to fight them. Black soldiers were also sent to protect white shelters. Because the West was so vast, it was difficult to enforce laws as more and more white shelters arrived. Outlaws stole cattle and horses from shelters and also robbed banks and stagecoaches that brought important supplies and mail. Black soldiers were sent to fight off these tribes. Gaining a reputation. Black soldiers were given the hardest and most dangerous duties. They traveled across some of the most difficult landscapes in the country to find water, build roads, and map lands unexplored by white shelters. They experienced terrible heat in the summer and freezing cold weather in the winter. They retrieved old horses, poor supplies, and damaged equipment. Black soldiers also experienced the violence, sometimes deadly, from the white shelters they were sent to protect. In spite of these, the troops performed their duties well. They were known to be brave, hardworking, and talented. It was the native peoples they fought, possibly the Cheyenne, who gave them the name Buffalo Soldiers. Many people think the soldiers reminded native peoples of buffalo in some way. Some believe the soldiers were given the name because they were brave in battle like the buffalo. There is no proof to support this belief, however, and the idea is challenged by many native leaders today. Cathy Williams. Cathy Williams was the only woman known to have served as a buffalo soldier. He joined the 38th Infantry Regiment in 1866 because women weren't earned to serve as a soldier at the time. He disguised herself as a man and went by the name William Cathy. Williams served for nearly 2 years until she was discharged in 1868 when a doctor described during a hospital visit that she was a woman. Later service. Buffalo soldiers served the West throughout the decades of war between the U.S. Army and Native peoples. 18 Buffalo soldiers were awarded Medals of Honor between 1870 and 1819. The Medal of Honor is the highest award a U.S. soldier can earn. As wars in the West came to an end, many black soldiers were sent to fight in the Spanish-American War. During the 10-week war in 1898, Buffalo soldiers earned 5 more Medals of Honor. After the war, hundreds of Buffalo soldiers worked as park rangers in 2 national parks in California. Between 1899 and 1904, they oversaw the buildings of roads and trails, fought forest fires, and stopped people from hunting animals. Buffalo soldiers on bikes. In the 1890s, the Army wanted to see if bicycles could replace horses since bikes were cheaper and easier to care for. The Buffalo soldiers rode 1,900 miles, 3,057 kilometers, from Missoula, Montana, to St. Louis, Missouri. They crossed mountains, rivers, and shifting sand hills and still averaged 50 miles, 80.4 kilometers, a day. Before long, through bikes were replaced with motorcycles. Discrimination continues. In spite of the reputation and many achievements of the Buffalo soldiers, black soldiers continue to experience discrimination. In August 1906, white people in a small Texas town accused Buffalo soldiers as a nearly fort of killing one white man and hunting another. There was no proof that the soldier did this, and their officials said the men were in bed at the time of the shooting. Still, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered 167 black soldiers to leave the army. The soldiers lost their pensions, payments people receive after their time in the army ends. It wasn't until 1972 that the soldiers were found innocent of the crime. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, the racist policies of President Woodrow Wilson kept black soldiers from joining white U.S. soldiers in battle in Europe. Instead, they were placed under the command of the French army. By the time the United States entered World War II in 1941, the regiments known as the Buffalo Soldiers had been disbanded. Black soldiers and white soldiers remained separate until the Korean War in the 1950s. The Army disbanded the last all-black regiments in 1951. The troops joined white regiments where they continued to face racism from officers and soldiers. Notable Buffalo Soldiers. L.D. Henry O. Flipper was the first black graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He was the first black officer to command black soldiers. L.T. John Hanks Alexander became commander of the 9th Cavalry in 1887. At the time, he was the only black officer in the Army commissioned to lead troops in combat. Cole Charles Young was the commanding officer at the 9th Cavalry. In 1943, he became the first black national park superintendent. The legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers. Black soldiers have fought in every important war in American history. However, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 1st, 9th, and 10th Cavalries are perhaps the best known. People have written books, movies, television shows, and even songs about them. People have also built museums and monuments in their honor. Despite experiencing racial discrimination from within and outside the army, the Buffalo Soldiers were the least likely soldiers to desert their regiments. They showed courage in defense of fierce combat, deadly violence, difficult living conditions, and racism. Their service is an important part of United States history.